recovery situation. In other words, let the market do its recession adjustment work quickly so that you get back to full employment very rapidly. Now, before 1929, I'm not saying we had monetary freedom before 29, but before 1929, the government did not interfere in recessions. It somehow felt that its business was allowed the free market to work. And so recessions were over with very quickly. For example, the 2021 recession, which Benjamin Anderson called the last free market recession, last pre-New Deal recession, it had been brought about by the government through wartime inflation and so forth. But once the recession hit, the government had hands off, and the recession, which was very deep, it was real depression, it was big unemployment, prices fell sharply, it was a lot of bankruptcies. It was over in 9 months, essentially over. By the time the status of that period, who were getting stronger, not as strong as they were later, by the time the status had convinced President Harding, by the way, Harding is one of my favorite, well, my only quasi-favorite president of the 20th century. He's kind of a lovable character. His instincts were pretty good. He just wanted to sit in the White House and play poker. And by the time the statists, who were headed by Hoover, by the way, it's another story I can't get into now since I'm already getting over time. The statists headed by Hoover, just about, who was very powerful in the Harding administration, just about convinced Harding to start intervening massively. We've got to check this depression. We've got a big public works increase and big inflation of credit. By the time he was able to convince Harding, the recession was over. The free market had worked so fast that the government couldn't intervene. At that point, Hoover pledged to himself and to the public that if he became president, he would not wait. He would intervene right away. Okay? And sure enough, in the fall of 1929, he was unfortunately president, and we had a big stock market crash. He intervened massively and immediately, and thereby prolonged the depression for his 4 years in office. And Roosevelt essentially intensified his policies, prolonged it until he got us into war in 1940-41. So, the Austrian position then is, if you're in a boom period, stop inflating fast as soon as possible, right away, push the button, stop expanding money, and then sit the recession out. Don't intervene in it, so it will be over with fast. It's like the difference between a surgical thing where you cut off a tumor or something like that, or else a chronic depression where you're sick constantly and getting sicker. It's an acute thing versus a chronic depression. And so, by trying to fine-tune the system to end inflation without depression, Friedmanite monetarism got us into a big depression. And then by that time, then of course the deficits increased. Monetarism was discredited probably more than it should have been. Lafferism was discredited more than it should have been because they never tried Lafferism. They never had the tax cut to test it. But at any rate, the way the media operates and politics operates, the result of all this infighting is that the conservative Keynesians are now taking over. They're now in the saddle, and they're increasing deficits and increasing taxes to meet the deficits and so forth and so on. And we're back to the good old days of the
and profitability. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. Steve, a lot of companies think the principal issue to surviving a downturn is by reducing costs. How often do you think that's really true?
It's really not true almost all the time. Most companies' first reaction to a recession is really to cut back on their costs and hunker down, specifically cutting back on their sales and marketing activities. They look at that as an expense, but really marketing and sales is your revenue generator. That's what's going to generate revenues and generate profits for the company. And it's usually the wrong place to focus on initially. The companies that are most successful emerge from the recession stronger by identifying what their advantages are and pressing those advantages during the recession.
Steve, you did your first turnaround at a technology company when you were in Silicon Valley. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, that was really my PhD in business. Up until that point in time, all the companies I was at, budgets were never a problem. They were very high growth. But what I identified was sometimes it's better to drop back and punt. Basically, we're in for a tough recession now, probably the worst I've ever seen, and I've been through 4 or 5 of them. So businesses really have to act now, and they have to plan. And communication is going to be one of their keys to survival, to keep their customers happy and their employees happy.
So then if cutting costs is not the answer, what steps should a company take to cope with the downturn?
Well, really, they need to act. Speed's essential, but they have to act in the right way. They have to rethink their entire business model. Do a strategic business assessment. Find out what's going right and what's going wrong in the company. Reward success, kill failure. Don't just cut your budgets or reduce pricing. And that's another gut reaction when sales aren't going well, is companies reduce their pricing. They need to optimize their working capital. Cash is going to be king during recession. You can't do payroll without cash. We have a prime example of that right now in the auto industry. Ford was proactive. They got their working capital all squared away prior to the major part of the recession hitting, and it's put them in a much better position capital-wise than their two major competitors, GM and Chrysler, who have now had to take out loans from the federal government. But they have to examine all products, costs, and expenses, and even customers. One thing I learned in my turnaround is there is such a thing as an unprofitable customer. And you have to figure out, can I make them profitable? And if not, jettison them. They have to develop a realistic way of forecasting their sales. But not just a number that's going to happen. They need to identify specific markets, targets, that can identify 90 days out what their sales are going to be. Because if sales aren't going to happen, then they're going to need to react, maybe cut deeper. Align sales and marketing. Most companies, sales and marketing really fight each other. There are major opportunities for cost savings and to reduce the sales cycle when sales and marketing are working on the same page. Stop customer churn. I learned a long time ago it costs more to find new customers than keep existing customers. And so everybody in the company, from the receptionist to customer support to accounting, everybody needs to be in a sales mentality mode. Look at the markets that you're in. There may be some markets that are unprofitable, but you're generating reasonable revenues. So how can you reduce costs? One way might be to develop a strategic relationship or partnership where you're not selling directly into it, but through another party. If you're cutting back, make sure you cut back enough. Take all the bad news all at once. I learned that a long time ago. The last thing you want to do is if you're doing a reduction in force or layoffs, is go back 3 months out and have another layoff, and 3 months after that and have another layoff. It kills morale, not only in the employees, but with the customers and the investors and the board members. And everybody starts wondering, am I going to have a job tomorrow? And the work doesn't get done. So make sure you cut deeply enough so you can get back on the road to profitability. But more importantly is you've got to learn the art of communication with your employees, your investors, your customers, and the board during this entire process. And don't panic. Companies panic and they wind up reducing their pricing to their customers.